Welcome to Conversations with Asha and Steve, where communication matters. Join us as we discuss effective ways to communicate, bridge the gaps, and build long-lasting relationships within your business and life. Here are your hosts, Asha Prasad and Steve Harper.
Hey, welcome to Conversations with Asha and Steve. I am Steve Harper, and with me as always is my awesome co-host, Dr. Asha Prasad. And today we have a special, I don't know what we're calling you, Marc, but you're going to be interviewing us. I mean, this is like the Conversation with Asha and Steve takeover episode. So I'm kind of excited, but Marc Schwarz is joining us. If you watched an episode, a couple of episodes back, Marc joined us talking about the release of Asha's book, and he has been the editor for both Dr. Asha's book and mine, and we've worked with him for a lot of years, and we're excited to have him join us today for an exciting conversation between the three of us.
So thank you, Steve. Thanks, Asha. I'm excited to be here. These were great projects for me to be a part of, and I'm excited that we get to talk a little bit about them, and particularly because we want to talk about the fact that they both revolved and emerged from this COVID pandemic experience. Mm-hmm. So that's really the focus of the conversation here is, how do you do your personal life and your professional life in this pandemic? So let me just start by asking you both. Steve, last year, we updated your book, The Ripple Effect, Maximizing the Power of Relationships for Your Life and Business, whole new expanded third edition with a chapter that was dedicated just to rippling in the age of COVID. That came out last fall. Asha, you just released the Chrysalis Awakening, 5 questions for rediscovering your purpose and potential in uncertain times. Obviously, COVID is an uncertain time. So let me just throw this out there for whoever wants to start. Why did you both decide that it was important to address COVID head on in your writing?
Asha, I'm going to let you go first.
Well, thanks, Steve. You know what? Basically, you couldn't ignore the elephant in the room. It's there, right? We initially thought that COVID was going to be around for, just a little while, a few weeks, a few months, whatever it was. And then all of a sudden we started to notice that it's here to stay. It's changing the landscape in every single way, personal, professional, business. And you know what, Marc, it was interesting because, of course, we were writing a different book, and then this is the book that came out because we just couldn't ignore the elephant in the room. It was just like, wait a second. So I found it very, very important because all the conversations that I was starting to have on a more, day-to-day basis were just about all of this unknown territory. How do we manage ourselves? How do we manage our businesses? How do we navigate in business? How do we relate to each other? How do we connect with one another? And so that's what, for me, was the motivator of, let's just open it up and talk about it straight on, because I think it's going to be very helpful in not only now, but also in times of uncertainty that we have. So, yeah, that was my take on it. How about you, Steve?
Well, Marc and I had actually started working on the third edition because we had collected some new stories, and there were a few tweaks to the strategies that I wanted to include in the third edition. And then COVID hit, right? And we, like you said, we couldn't ignore the elephant in the room. And what I actually found is during that writing process, as those early days of COVID were upon us, I was actually seeing a lot of the people that I sort of look as introverted. They were reaching out with more regularity, either on social networks or directly via email. And I was finding that a lot of them were struggling at that point because now we were in lockdown. We were away from our work families, in some cases, our life families, our friends. People were growing more and more concerned. There was a lot of fear and uncertainty at the time. And, Marc and I started talking about it. It's like, what is, this forced isolation going to do to, people's participation in their day-to-day lives, that community, and how much they depend on it. And if introverts were already experiencing kind of withdrawal from people, extroverts had to be really going through major withdrawal. So it seemed like a really interesting component to add to the book because, given what we have now gone through, nearly 2 years into it, you're actually finding, that this new normal that we're experiencing, these situations where we've been kind of forced to separate and maybe work from home, or not necessarily congregate at a networking event or organized activities. This may not be the only time that we experience it in our lifetime, and so how do we deal with the next one? And so that became sort of the kind of the genesis of the chapter we put in there about connecting when we're sort of forced to connect in different forms, whether it be through Zoom, whether it be trying to figure out how to keep people engaged within your network, even if you're not seeing them or can't have lunch or meet at a networking event.
What's been the biggest challenge that your coaching clients have reported during this time? Has it been that forced isolation, or has it been the economic anxiety of changing job circumstances, or the inability to just maintain kind of a normal routine?
I'll take that one first.
Mm-hmm.
For the folks that I've worked with, it's a little bit of all of that, right? And we sort of thought this was going to be a short-lived experience, and it's turned into anything but. But and no end in sight at this point. But I think a lot of my clients have been really. There was they lost their identity when they weren't with other people, and they felt like that sense of isolation. There was a lot of depression. There was a lot of anxiety around that. There was a lot of frustration because you're now forced to be with family 24/7 and couldn't leave your homes, or just this challenge in their day-to-day lives and their schedules. How to conduct business, how to do meetings, how to continue to grow your business in ways that were way different than they had ever experienced. For a lot of my clients, they're very out there and engaged people in their communities. And so now suddenly you can't do that. So there was a real sense of trying to find a new level of identity that I think caused a lot of anxiety and conflict. And then the uncertainty of what the future holds, right? Obviously economic impact was huge for a lot of folks that I work with and that I support. And a lot of the challenges that these folks had was, there was no safety net for a lot of their consulting engagements. A lot of opportunities or projects were put on hold or outright canceled, and so there was a tremendous amount of concern. And rightly so. People didn't know, because none of us have been through this, right? We sort of have found ourselves all trying to find new footing in kind of this brave new world. What about you, Asha?
Yeah, you know what? A bit of the same. I think some of the biggest challenges were stress factors, stress related type of, all of a sudden they just found themselves kind of on their knees, kind of like, what am I going to do? Not only professionally, but personally as well. It's like really, really struggling on, also, I think one of the biggest things with some of the clients that I've worked with is that the weakened areas in their professional, especially in their businesses, really reared their ugly heads, because all of a sudden they were not face to face with their team. They realized, I've had some clients that had to really kind of rebuild their team in this whole time frame because of, certain things that were coming up. So there was just a lot of uncertainty. And I think that learning to navigate, especially for the introverts, like what we were talking about before, the introverts and extroverts, they deal with these kinds of things that happen in a different way.
Yeah.
So, some of the clients that I had were really, really struggling with figuring out, how am I going to be inspirational and motivational to my team when I am basically falling apart as an individual? How do I do that? And so it was a lot of those conversations. It was some very, very intense situations going on.
Well, and I would even say, Asha and I were struggling individually, right?
Yes.
We would find ourselves having these conversations offline, and there was a lot of concern and doubt about where things were going, right? We had pre-pandemic, both of us had a lot of things in motion on a lot of levels.
Yes.
I mean, we're sort of multifaceted entrepreneurs, so we work on a lot of different projects at a given time. And then to have everything just come to a screeching halt was scary. And there were a lot of sleepless nights in those first few weeks or first month when we were forced to, sort of be in lockdown. And, with no real, end in sight. And, we would get on every week prior to recording or prior to live streaming for the show. And we'd be like, oh my God, how is it over there? How's it over here?
Exactly.
And, are you seeing any signs of recovery? And, we went from when are we going to be able to go back to our somewhat normal routines to when are we going to have a vaccine? Is the vaccine going to work? And then, more stress got compounded as we went further on in the year because you had these different strains of the virus that were coming and the numbers were going clearly in the wrong direction. And, we were really struggling. And what was great about that time, I would say, is that at least for me, Asha became a really good sounding board for all that stress and anxiety that I couldn't necessarily share with my team or I couldn't necessarily,
Right.
share at home. But it was a great outlet for us to just kind of unload on one another and, sort of de-stress in some way, right?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, that fear was intense. I mean, it was, our clients were going through it, but we were going through it as well. And it was really because it was just the land of unknown. And of course, where I'm located, we really went through like hardcore lockdowns for a much longer time. So the whole economic piece of it and how am I going to keep things afloat in some of my businesses? How am I going to keep people employed? How, all those things were, and it's just like, okay, we've got to center ourselves individually, vent whenever we need to vent, get it out there, which we did a lot of.
Yeah.
But it was therapeutic. It was therapeutic.
What was great about that whole situation is I'd be stressing in the middle of the night and Asha would already be up because she lives in the future.
Exactly.
So it was like, oh my God. I go like to instant message. Hey, well, where are you? What are you doing? You're like, I'm having coffee. What? Why did I show that I was online? Dang it.
I love that. So she lives in the future. So Netherlands is the future. Is that?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Oh
Europe
boy,
is the
help
future.
us. Help us.
One of the things though, and I know that particularly, I had some of the same experience working with both of you, and Asha and I talked for a while, pretty much weekly about the book. And I feel like, the first, 20 minutes or so of our phone call was really just this kind of communal, session of catharsis as we kind of vent. But one of the things that I really love is that in both of your books, I think you're very honest about the challenges that people are facing during this time. I don't think that you sugarcoat that at all. And I think you honor that and you deal with it up front. But then there's this sort of underlying optimism that there is in the midst of these challenges, potential and opportunity. So how did you manage to, as you're going through your own personal COVID crises and you're managing your team crises and your client crises, how did you find that silver lining, a message that you could broadcast out there that ultimately is one of hope?
That's a great question. I'm going to take this one.
Please.
The way I see that, Mark, is that like, just personally as an individual, myself, that's kind of my set point. I've really trained myself that's my come from. That's where I'm coming from in my life. That's my perspective. That's a lens that I look through, is trying to see what the silver lining is, whether it's something that I can learn from it, something I can grow from or share with other people. So when you have that as your set point, and this is why I think it's so important, what lens we look through, in life in general, then it becomes easier and more manageable in those times that you don't linger in the negativity. You don't linger in that for too long. And especially whenever you are responsible for a lot of other people, as an entrepreneur, I think that you really, when you have that responsibility, it's one of those things that you just know that, I can't let myself get in my own way. But if I do, it's going to get in the way of everybody else too, that I am responsible for or working with directly. So for myself, it's really about that set point that I have learned and trained for. It's, it's interesting because I say trained for, it's not like I was training for, how am I going to deal with the COVID pandemic? It's not like that, but it's like, but it was trained for in the sense of, how do I want to deal with the world? How am I dealing? What's my set point? And that has really helped tremendously to be able to see the silver lining and say, okay, this is this is not good. This is not going well, but how can we shift this? How can we pivot from here? So, yeah.
That was good. I mean, and you were a constant reminder for me, that, we're going to get through this. We don't know when, don't know how, but we will. And I think during the COVID lockdown, phase specifically, you were a shining light of positivity for me. And you were as well, Marc. I mean, when we were having these conversations, I mean, it was there, there's sort of safety and comfort in numbers. And the more conversations I had with people that were more positive and upbeat, the more positive and upbeat that I tended to be. When you're alone and isolated, which a lot of us were, and certainly familiar with because of the COVID situation, it's easy to get in your own head and let those fears and those unknown stories take over. And that was super, super relevant to me because it was happening. And so when we started writing, it was important to address those things and start to look for the positive side of things. And so I think in a lot of ways, to a certain degree, Asha, we have been training for this for a long time. As entrepreneurs and as coaches, we have we've sort of gone through these things in maybe different context, right? Different turbulent times because we're entrepreneurs and business owners, and different scenarios that we come up against. And when we've gone through those or experienced it either personally or through client relationships, it's been pretty ideal for us to be able to be prepared for whatever gets thrown at us. And this just happened to be another one of those situations where, hey, okay, we can't control everything, so what do we need to do to address it? And giving up a little bit of the angst that you can't be in control all the time and that you have to go with the flow a little bit, I think was somewhat cathartic. At least it was for me. And then looking on the positive side of it is, what am I going to turn this experience into that I can make something out of it? And so when we worked on our book, Marc, the thing that was certainly the most prideful thing for me was that I know that there are some tools, ideas, and strategies that can help people, but especially in these kinds of circumstances when maybe you're isolated, you get relocated, by your company and you're in a brand new work environment. Well, very similar to lockdown. You don't know anybody. You don't have those social ties. So what are you going to do to kind of get engaged? How are you going to stay connected to the people that are important to you back from where you came? And so looking at those kinds of things, isolation, I think, can be forced upon us in many ways, right? Job change, switching, locations, like Asha, picking everything up and moving to a completely different country and starting
the future,
over and
apparently.
starting something new. Yeah, the
apparently
future.
I'm in the future.
Hitting the time machine. But I think that there was a lot of opportunity to look at this situation that we were all facing and say, okay, what can I learn from this, and what do I want to take away from this? And, I knew, and I had people in my own network, they were like, oh, this is like a forced vacation. This is fantastic. And maybe for a few days that was the case. Like, you could binge Netflix and you didn't have to be at the office, and, you didn't feel like you were forced to, stick to the normal, 8 to 5 schedule. But then that was really short-lived. And then after that, people were really, really starting to struggle. Yeah. And like Asha said, there was a lot of stress. There was a lot of mental anxiety. And so I felt like this was an opportunity for us to, and I think both of us do an excellent job in the books of contributing. What do we do next time this comes up, or something similar to it?
Yeah, that's one of those things that I really do like about both of the books, is that they don't just dwell on the COVID experience. There really is this looking forward, to the idea that whether it's another pandemic or it's just just in Asha, in your subtitle, I mean, this idea that there are going to be uncertain times. Anxiety is going to be with us, and whether that's a result of something that's individualized and localized to you, or it's something that we get to share as a larger community, it's always going to be with us. So in the process of writing this, I guess for people who maybe aren't familiar with either book, and shame on you if you're not, because you should go out and get them, electronically or in print, or there are Audible copies of The Ripple Effect for sure. And Asha, is your Audible out yet?
It's out. It's
okay.
Out. Yeah,
that's Asha's book right there. You can learn more about the book at the Chrysalis Awakening book.com. So you better get this book. It'll change your life. I promise you.
They are both really excellent books, and I know I'm biased because I was privileged to work on both of them. But But here's my question to you. If you, for people who aren't familiar with it, if you have to pull out sort of one maybe specific strategy or some specific tool, what's the one thing you would want to really sort of leave our listeners with in terms of like, if there's one thing you can do today to try to mitigate the effects of COVID in their life, personal or professional right now, what they're feeling, what they're dealing with, what's the one thing that they can maybe leverage without, having to invest in a new career or go back to school or make some kind of longer term investment? What's something right now that they can walk away from this podcast and start working on?
I'll take that one first, if you don't mind, Asha.
Yeah, sure.
Recognizing and communicating how important people are to you. I think at the end of the day, this gave people an opportunity to kind of take stock of who really meant something to them in their life. And, there is a certain sense of uncertainty even today with COVID. I have a good friend who just lost her husband. This guy vaccinated, is the epitome of health, and yet he passed away from it, right? And nobody expected that. And so I think to a certain degree, this should give everybody a reason to recalibrate who's important to me in my life, who do I depend on, not only for my success, but my happiness, and really taking stock, and then not just thinking it, but actually expressing it. And, being, out there to the point that says, if nothing else, this COVID situation gave me reason to really realize how important certain individuals are to my life. And so I think for, my bit of advice would be to really take stock of those folks that are important to you. Maybe even those people that aren't as, critical to your life or your happiness, and maybe, making room in your network, personal or professional, for other people to come in and that maybe are a bit more deserving of that spot in your LinkedIn or in your Facebook friends feed or whatever. And, really just kind of allow yourself the ability to kind of, sharpen up who you really want to be, spending time with and connecting with. And for me, that I think is one important tip, which, I tell people that all the time, but I think COVID actually really put it kind of front and center for me specifically, because, we now had time on our hands to start looking at that. And for me, conversations with you two and so many other folks really got me through that uncertainty during this time. Being able to pick up the phone and call somebody and say, hey, how are you doing? How are you guys dealing with this? Was the great conversation starter of 2020 and 2021, right? And yet so many people still didn't do that, right? They might have tried to keep up with people via social networks or different platforms like that, but they weren't actually picking up the phone and actually having conversations. And this became the perfect opportunity to do so. And hopefully people continue to carry that forward and leverage that kind of strategy to find and deepen some of those key relationships.
I think that's great, Steve. I totally agree with you on that. I think that this has been a ideal time to be able to evaluate those and really figure out who you're in relationship with and all facets of your life and strengthen those relationships. I would say the tip that I would give people is along the same lines, but it's more about finding what your purpose is, what your why is. I found that, this time has given us, we all have a limited time. We don't know how much time we all have. And why would we be spending it doing things that we're not passionate about or that don't bring us joy? Really, I think that this is a big one that I really would want people during this time to really start looking at. If you're in any situation, professional or personal, that you are not happy about, that maybe you've just been doing because you thought you needed to, or because you were supposed to, or whatever it may be, now is the time, I think, more than ever, to evaluate that and figure out what your why is, figure out what it is that you want to be doing and contributing in the time that you have. I think that that's a really, really big one that I've been having a lot of conversations with people about this too, that have read the book so far. And they're just like, that's one of the biggest things that people are really starting to really look at. And I think it's really important. I think it's super important.
Yeah,
Well,
you've got some great stories in there too about
Yeah,
people who during this time have, radically
yes,
changed the trajectory of their lives. Um,
exactly.
and I think it's
Yeah.
really inspiring.
well, and your book
Yeah.
definitely, like I said, I'm on the third tour of it now because every time I've read through it, I'm picking up more, morsels of information and ideas. And really, at the end of the day, it is, where do you want to spend your time?
Mm-hmm.
Where do you want to invest that? Because
Yeah.
like you said, we don't have any understanding of when when our time is up.
Yeah.
And if COVID doesn't get people to think about how important life is, and
Mm-hmm.
where we should be investing our time and energies in not only our jobs but the relationships. I think if that didn't shake you to your core at this point, reading through your book and thinking through, am I really where I want to be, and am I really happy doing what I'm doing? Just asking those 5 questions will completely open up your perspective to maybe have a deeper, more intimate conversation with yourself to really evaluate.
Mm-hmm.
And I think before it was just easy. I'll get to that. I'll
Right.
eventually spend some time thinking about it. Well, some of
Yeah.
this has actually been forced upon us, and some of us are still dealing with that, right? And so,
Right.
I think in a big way, this is still kind of life's reminder that, hey, look, this is an opportunity for you to push the reset button.
Yeah. That's true, Steve.
So, again, I love the vulnerability in both books. You sort of put out there, that you're not apart from any of these challenges. Uh, in the process of writing these, particularly in this particular environment, what did you discover? What did you learn, either about the people that you work with, or about yourself, or about how you spend your time? I guess, were there any aha moments there, as you're on the journey along with your readers and listeners?
Go for it, Asha.
I know. I
Yeah,
was
I
just going
see
to
Steve
say.
smile, and
I
I'm just
see
like,
Steve.
huh, huh.
I know Steve's.
There's a story
I
there.
saw him as he's reaching for his coffee. Asha, you go. Okay. So yeah, I know you.
So,
um, you know what? I think definitely some personal evaluation of relationships, of who I was spending my time with, and also things that I was doing personally and professionally really came to light for me. And I've had some really big revelations in that. My perspective has changed. I'm shifting gears actually in a lot of ways, and letting some things fall to the wayside because they just aren't, it's not that they're not important, they're just not meaningful to me anymore. And as far as relationships, some relationships have been shifting as well, and that's okay too. It's not that they're not meaningful, it's just that sometimes in order for us to thrive and to grow in our life, we have to take a distance sometimes, and we have to change course, we have to take a different path. And that has been the biggest, those are the biggest things that I have been learning through this time, and actually taking action steps in order to make changes in that.
yeah,
Yeah,
that's
I
good.
Yeah.
remember when we were working on your book, Asha, and
Hmm.
talking about people who outside of the work environment now, like that was sort of the lockdown when they were at home,
Exactly. Yes.
realizing I was kind of in a toxic environment in some ways,
Exactly.
right? Like I'm
Yeah,
suddenly not
that's right.
around those people. And
Right.
it's like, oh, I can breathe a little freer. And so I think we talked several times about people that you were working with. It said, okay, I've had to reevaluate sort of my network and my
Yeah.
setting and the people that I interact with on a daily basis. And I understand maybe the impact that they're having on me. And that impact isn't always positive. And so,
Right.
I think that's a really sort of interesting perspective. It's like until you make the change, you don't always realize how needed it
It's true.
was.
Yep, that's
So,
true. That is true.
yeah. Steve, what about you? What did you
Uh,
discover during this?
Yeah, well, 2 things. We were already working on the third edition of the book, like I mentioned earlier, but, that there was, it sort of reignited my flame for what the ripple means and what it can be to the world. And rather than, hey, this is going to be, the third edition and it's, and it's, we'll see what happens and where it goes. I think it reignited my passion for why the power of connecting is even more important today. You and I sat in a meeting recently, and we were talking about, we're the most connected society that we ever have been, but we're the most isolated and lonely than we've ever been, right? It seems so counterintuitive when we have so many easy ways for us to connect, and yet people have lost that talent, that ability to do it. And as different generations come in that were raised on their phones, and the only connection, that they know is through electronic devices, it has reignited my passion to teach people how critical and important it is to connect and engage and build relationships, not only for your personal life or your professional life, but for organizations, to recognize how critical it is, especially for organizations that are trying to figure out what we do next, right? Do we bring people back to the office? Do we leave them virtual? How do I continue to, find ways to foster engagement internally? How do we stay connected to our customers, build those relationships with prospective customers? So, rather than thinking that the ripple was kind of maybe at the, its final chapter, so to speak, I kind of feel like I suddenly have realized it's at the very beginning stages. Even though we've been doing this for 15 plus years, there's so much more to go and so much more to do with it. So that's definitely one thing. The other thing I would say that I learned was how to be vulnerable and how to be open to, giving up control within my companies to certain people to get things done, even if I couldn't see them or browbeat them to get it done day to day at the office. Being able to delegate and admit that I didn't have all the answers, right? I didn't know what was going to go on and what was going to happen. I just told the story to, an organization I spoke to, but, we made a hire during COVID when everybody was going backwards. We were going forwards, right? Because I had to have assurances that our business was going to scale and continue to grow during some uncertain times. And it scared the crap out of me because I started running the numbers and started looking at, what the impact could be if things didn't go the way that we expected to, and had to be willing to have that conversation, not only with my executive team, but really with myself. Am I prepared to put in the extra time, energy, and effort to make it successful, despite what might be thrown at us? And so that required a whole sense of vulnerability on my end to be willing to take some chances that I probably wouldn't have normally taken. So grateful I did. We ended up making a couple of hires during COVID, and our, my software company specifically is kind of scaling in the right direction. But that vulnerability piece is not something I'm known for. I sought outside counsel from, Asha, from, several good friends that are entrepreneurs that I saw were struggling themselves, that were going the wrong direction with their business, either having to lay off. I have one friend that actually had to shut down her business. Yet I still sought, sort of their advice and guidance because I wanted to make sure I was looking at everything from all the possible angles. And so that was pretty big for me. And it's something I'm not going to go back to my old ways. I think I'm going to stay committed to, keeping that level of vulnerability and that openness as my daily operating process, because it has been super enlightening for me. And because of that, I think, it has helped us continue to be successful on all levels. So that's really what I learned and what I'll take away from this 10 years from now. When I'm thinking back to what this experience was, it was a big growth phase for me.
Hey, it's interesting, Steve, because I can notice that in you, in that growth. I have witnessed your growth. Really, seriously, especially in that vulnerability.
Around the midsection, that's where you...
Hey, that's just a COVID belly. No, I'm just kidding.
That's right.
No.
The quarantine 15.
Yeah.
It's a reality.
Yeah.
It's a reality.
All that bread baking that we did at the beginning of it, that was a problem. Too many carbs. Do y'all think that there is a lasting impact of COVID here? And I feel like that's the question we've been asking since, last fall. If COVID isn't really going away, maybe, it's a lasting impact because we are going to live with this virus in some form or fashion for the foreseeable future. But, setting that issue aside, I mean, do you think that sort of the lessons we've learned and the perspective that we've gained during this time sticks with us as a society, as a work culture? or do we kind of go back to business as normal? And I'd like to get your thoughts on that.
I would hope so. I think our natural tendency as human beings is to, once we get past it, it's, kind of didn't happen, or the power of it is somehow lost. I kind of, we just celebrated the 20th anniversary of 9/11, right? And I remember how united the country was when that happened, and how didn't matter what political party affiliation you were, how everybody came together and everybody was united around a common cause, which was, we were not going to be defeated, and we were united as a country. And that we had what I call, kind of that united, front for a good period of time. I want to say 12 to 18 months for sure, following the tragedy of 9/11. But then it just started to fall apart, right? Political season came around, and, there was the typical divisiveness that started to happen. And then, you think back as 20 years later, how different, we are as a country in comparison to where we were. And, we're back we've gone backwards in a lot of ways in that regard. We didn't learn those lessons, and we didn't learn what we could do and how much we could accomplish if we were united together. And we somehow forgot that just magically, because time just replaces, our narrative, or the stories we tell ourselves about what those times were. And my hope is that this time around, this is another major event that we've all experienced. We've all gone through it together. We all have that common experience, that we do it differently this time. And, we have more proactive conversations about what did we learn during lockdown? What did we learn during this pandemic? What were the fears that we had and experienced, both as individuals, as business leaders, and what can we learn from this to carry us forward, to stay focused and united in some capacity? My hope is that we can do that. Obviously, there's political, issues around the whole COVID situation about vaccination and masking, and there's a lot of divisiveness around COVID in general. But the general process of COVID, right? The pandemic being what the pandemic is, I want to hope that we can take some lessons and we can learn from it. We can build from this, and do some things differently. How we treat one another, how we respond and react to certain situations, and that we can all come together and say, hey, this won't defeat us either. So that's at least my take.
Yeah, you know what? My hope is that we do it as well. It's just, I think that the way things are right now, especially in the part of the world that I'm in the future, I feel like I'm seeing a big divide, unfortunately. And you know what I mean? Like you have a group of people that are actually looking at it and reflecting upon and saying, okay, these are long-lasting lessons. These are long-lasting changes that we're going to do. We're going to take forward, and that's what's going to happen. And then there's other people that are so in so much resistance, actually, to the changes, to the lessons, to the things that I'm not sure. My hope is that we can, the people that are really looking at it for the long term and saying we're going to take this forward, I hope that we can unite along the way and be able to bring people together. That would be my hope. But I definitely think that on an individual basis, as well as, whether it's, companies, whatever it is, that we do have some long lasting changes that are going to be here from here on out. We're not going to go back to quote unquote the normal that we thought we were in. We're just not going to, in some aspects. I think that some of those things are just here to stay.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, I hope that maybe 6 months from now, sometime in the spring, maybe we all get back together. We revisit this. We see what variant we're on at that point. Yeah. But if not, I'd love to sort of see what those impacts maybe are going forward, because I agree with you. There's and I think in both the books, for all the challenges, there's this real cause for sustainable optimism surrounding some of the things that we've been forced to do, some of the perceptions we've been forced to change, and the questions we've had to grapple with during this time. And I think in both your books, you do a fantastic job of giving readers some tools. So for your listeners, if you have not gotten your third edition of The Ripple Effect, Maximizing the Power of Relationships for Your Life and Business, I would very much encourage that you do that. It's got a lot of new content, not just COVID related, but that chapter is, I think, exceptional and filled with terrific stories and a lot of great actionable tips. And then Dr. Asha's book that just came out, The Chrysalis Awakening, 5 Questions for Rediscovering Your Purpose and Potential in Uncertain Times. All of these available in ebook form from the Kindle store, in print form, and on Audible now, right?
Yes.
So
you didn't even tell me it came out on Audible. We've been talking all this time.
I know. It slipped my mind, Steve. No, I'm just kidding.
You must know somebody like with back channels, because it took me forever to get my thing approved at Audible. But no, Dr. Asha's just flies right on through. I promise you, if you buy the Chrysalis Awakening book, there are some hidden gems within that book that tell you how to make life just work out for you. It's true, I swear. Well, Marc, we really appreciate you facilitating today's conversation. For those of you that are listening on the podcast, we greatly appreciate it wherever your ears may lead you to this podcast. One thing I have to say before we go that COVID really did thrust upon us, and I have Asha to blame for this, is that we actually now have been doing live streams and got on video. And so we've had a whole new audience that has gotten exposure to these great conversations that Dr. Asha and I have virtually every week. And so that was something that really positive that came out of COVID for us, and that we were able to, challenge ourselves with new technology and new ways to get this message out. And we've opened up so many new conversations for people to have. And I know, Asha, you've had these experiences, I have as well, where people have said, hey, I was listening to your episode and you guys were talking about, this, that, or the other. And I use that on my next virtual Zoom meeting, and we were talking about it with our teams. We were using it at our book club or whatever. There were these, great opportunities to take these conversations and actually turn them into action for other people out there in the world, whether they were connecting face to face, as that starts to come back, or still in those virtual formats. We were getting people to think on a different level. And so that's been a really positive thing to come out of this.
No, definitely. Thank you. I want to say thank you to both of you. I mean, Steve, in that process of getting us, you have been the technical guru behind the scenes on all of it. So, that's really been very, very, very helpful. And look at how much you're doing now. It's amazing. And Marc, in this whole process, you have been an integral part of going through this entire last 18, 19 months and bringing so much positivity and your insights and your wisdom. And thank you so much for joining us today and being able to facilitate this conversation today. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah.
It's been a lot of fun.
Great friend to the show, and you've been, a great supporter of our work. But not only are you a phenomenal editor, but you have really taken hold of our concepts and been able to help tease out all the best that we can come up with relative to both what Dr. Asha and I work on. And so I want to just, second what Asha said. During this process, I really do think that those, and I know it was for Asha, it definitely was for me, that writing process, that back and forth, those dialogues, those conversations we were having throughout the COVID, situation, the lockdowns, especially as we were getting into the heavy parts of writing, those were really instrumental in terms of keeping me, focused and committed going forward. So definitely appreciate that.
So, well, thank you. I was privileged to work on both projects, and I'm so excited for what you've produced and to see how it helps people.
Awesome. Well, hey, for our listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. Again, if you are getting this on a podcast, we encourage you to go to conversationswithashaandsteve.com to learn how to get a hold of our YouTube channel. But I think you can actually just type in Conversations with Asha and Steve in YouTube, and you'll find our videos. If you're like, live stream, I don't even know what you're talking about. Well, you get to see Asha's beautiful face and, mine not so beautiful face. But if you're not joining us on a live stream, and actually this is a recorded episode, we most of the time on Fridays will be live streaming, but this will actually go up on a Friday that Dr. Asha and I have other business engagements, so we're not going to be live streaming, but this will go up on Facebook. So we encourage you to go to Facebook and look for Conversations with Asha and Steve as well, and join our community. Tell us some conversation topics that you'd like us to cover in the future episode. Let us know what you're thinking. Like we said before, if you really like what you're hearing, leave us a review on Apple Podcast. Join our YouTube channel. Give us a like, give us a subscribe, and most importantly, share it to people that you think will benefit from these conversations, because that's how we grow our listenership and our audience. So we greatly appreciate it. Asha, we'll be back very, very soon with another live stream, and can't wait for that conversation to happen. And again, Marc, thank you so much for helping us today.
Thank you.
It was great to have you, for sure.
Thank you.
All right, you guys take care. Have a great, wonderful weekend.
Thanks, you too. Bye.
All right, bye.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode of Conversations with Asha and Steve. We love to hear feedback and questions from our listeners. Please feel free to visit our Facebook page for more tips and information. You can also email us directly at info@ripplecentral.com for more information.